All right, so we learned about the Articles of Confederation before, and we found out that the Articles of Confederation was a huge failure for our country. We first tried that kind of a government, and it did not work because the articles were too weak, couldn't collect tax, and a number of other reasons we talked about. So the founding fathers figured out we need to try something different. So they all got together to try to come up with a new kind of government, something different. All right. This was at the First Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. But once they started, they found out that there was more difficulties ahead. One thing you find about government is, nothing ever makes everyone happy, and you have to come up with some kind of solutions. And there's rarely like a perfect solution. It's difficult. So some fights erupted, and our country was on the verge of, breaking down and not being able to be a country. Maybe each state would be its own country. We could have definitely went that way. But some of the issues they had were the big populated states and the small states had disagreements. The slave states and the states without slaves had disagreements, big ones. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists fought, our first two parties in the country, about how our government should be formed. So right away, there was huge threats to whether or not we could have a functioning country. The answer, like so many other things in government, is, of course, to compromise. Compromise means both sides give up some of what they want, and as a result, you get something that maybe no one's perfectly happy with, but you get something that both sides can live with, a compromise, right? It is the key to a functioning government. One of our presidents said, compromise is the oil that makes the machine of government work. Without compromise, without oil in an engine, it seizes up and it doesn't work. Without compromise in a government, things can't move. You're stuck. And one side says, this is what I want. The other side, this is what I want. Nothing happens. You got to have that compromise to make the engine work. So let's talk first about the first big compromise. It's called the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. And here's basically how it worked. The bigger states with more people, like Virginia, for example, they wanted each state to have the number of people in the government based on how many people you have in your state. The small states wanted every state gets the same amount of people in the government. So whether you are Rhode Island with not very many people or Virginia with tons of people, they thought that each of those states should get the same amount of votes. Let's say one, right? But just like the Articles of Confederation, each state gets one. Virginia was like, well, wait a minute. If we have 10 times more people than you, we should have 10 times more people in the government than you. So there was a disagreement here. The small states thought that they would get run over by the big states if that happened. And the big states said, well, look, we have more people. We should have more say. That's the most fair way to do it. So what was the compromise? The compromise was to make a bicameral or a two-house government. In one of them, so the House of Representatives, in one of them, if you have more people in your state, you have more people in the government. That's the House of Representatives. But in the Senate, that made the small states happy. Everyone gets the same number. So everyone gets 2 senators, no matter if you're a small state or a big state. So we did both of them to make a compromise. Okay. This diagram or chart here shows you what that means. So like Congress is both of those things. So when I say the word Congress, that's what I mean. Both the Senate and the House of Representatives equals the Congress. Then you have the slave states and the free states disagreeing. Okay, so the slave states thought that when you count up how many people you have in your state to decide how many people to have in the government, the slave states said, well, we should count all the slaves. So if we have 500,000 free people and 500,000 slaves, that you add those together, that's 1 million human beings. So we should get 1 million's people's worth of people in the representatives in the House of Representatives. And the free states were like, wait a minute. You can't count your slaves. You don't even treat them like people. So if you treat them like property, how can you count property as a person? If you treat them like a person, then yeah, you can have more representation. So the North states and the South states disagreed. The South states were like, well, we have to pay to take care of all of these people, so we should have more say because keeping slaves is an expensive thing. The Northern states were like, well, you don't have to keep them as slaves. So it was a huge disagreement. And the odd compromise that a lot of people don't know about is they actually decided to count slaves as 60% of a human being. So they could count them, but they could only count them at 3/5 of a fraction or 60% of a person. So if you have, say, 10 slaves, that counts for like 6 people. Or if you have 5 slaves, that counts for 3 people. And then, so they got to count them, but they didn't get to count all of them. Very strange, but that's the compromise. You had to do something to move it forward. Otherwise, the slave states would have just said, no, we're not in your country. Well, we'll find out later, of course, in history, that ends up being a bigger problem than you may think. Okay, another compromise. You have these two parties. Like George Washington didn't want to have parties. He was very strongly against parties, but because he thought it would, make things ugly in the country. Nowadays we can kind of see that that's true to an extent. But these were the first two parties. It's pretty hard to stop parties from forming because both sides are trying to get a majority. And if you get a majority, you get to control things. So both, parties are kind of a natural thing that happens. You have these two parties here, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists were the ones that supported a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists wanted a weak central government. If you remember, the Articles of Confederation had a weak central government, and each state got to do their own thing in the Articles. The Anti-Federalists were afraid that our government would end up like the King of England, of Britain, like how bad all that went. They thought that was going to happen again. So they're like, okay, well, let's make a government that doesn't make the central government so strong so we don't have a king. The Federalists were like, hey, we need to have a strong central government so that we can actually function, because we don't even, like, everyone thinks we're a joke. George Washington thought the other countries thought we were a joke, and we needed to, have a stronger army, and we needed to be stronger in general and act together as one. So we needed a strong thing. And so they decided to pass the Constitution. So the Federalists won. They got their Constitution that they wanted, but the Anti-Federalists won too, because they put in a Bill of Rights in the Constitution that said that, okay, here's the government, but the government can't take away these rights that we write down here. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all these things, these are in the Constitution, so you can never, ever take those away. So both sides, the Federalists won and the Anti-Federalists won. Here it is again. Federalists got their Constitution they wanted. The Anti-Federalists got the Bill of Rights to protect people from the government. So both sides won there. Okay, our government was formed because of these compromises, very, very important. We have the longest standing democracy in the world, 250 years or so. Very successful, our country, one of the most successful countries in history, if you look by any measure, economic or political. So it worked out pretty well. And that's the end. We lived happily ever after, right? Wrong. Turns out that we have to constantly fix and perfect our government and make it better. We can't just say, oh, done, here it is, it's perfect. No, we have to make it better and better all the time. Democracy doesn't happen by magic. We have to keep working on it and make it the way that we want it. Very, very key. Okay, that's it for today.